My name is Julia Buxton and I'm a professor in the School of Public Policy. And the panel that we have here today is part of a 4-day workshop which we have been engaged in, which is in particular looking at the gendered impacts of drug policy. So in effect, what we're talking about is how men and women are differentially affected by the implementation of counter-narcotics policies. And the way that we've been framing our workshop is that we see counter-narcotics policies as wholly counterproductive and contrary to the interests of development, security, human rights and public health. And for many of us who are in this workshop, we have people who are working on drug consumption among women, drug trafficking, drug production, drug cultivation, and we're looking at the impact on women in terms of access to treatment services, rehabilitation, and various other social welfare aspects. Now, when you're talking about gender isn't just about talking about women, it's about talking about men and women and how they're differentially, as I said before, impacted. But what we wanted to do in this workshop was to specifically focus on the experience of women, and then we will be applying some of the findings in terms of how this reflects also the experience of men. So the panel that we have today are three people with infinitely more exciting names than I have. So first of all, we have Marie Nougier from IDPC, which is the International Drug Policy Consortium. We have Luciana Paul, who's from CELS in Argentina. And we have Corina Giacomello, who is with the Justice for Women and the University of Chiapas. And they are here today really kind of building also on a project which has involved colleagues such as Coletta Youngers, who's from the Washington office on Latin America, which has been looking at a very, very interesting phenomena, which has been this astonishing increase in the number of women who are incarcerated for drug-related offences in Latin America.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for all of us to have come to this talk. As Julia said, some of the things that we are going to discuss tonight are informed by all the discussions we have these days. I come from an Argentinian human rights organization. My organization was founded during the dictatorship in Argentina and did not have a focus or a particular interest in drug policy. Our first call of attention to the drug law implications for the global situation of and enjoyment of human rights in Argentina and in the region started around 10 years ago, and precisely with this problem that Julia was referring to of the massive incarceration of women. And we ran into this situation running research on violence, dynamics of violence inside women's prisons that took us to do a field work and to visit each one of the prison for women in the country. So what the things that I will tell you, and I will start with a brief overview of what we've seen, what we encounter as a situation related with drugs that affect human rights in the region, and then I will go briefly to some of the common stories that all of organizations conducting interviews in jail have found. So I guess you're familiar with the fact that in most of the countries in the world, the spirit that guides the policies toward illicit drugs is the total prohibition, the prohibition of all the activities related to a certain list of substances that are identified as illegal. So to produce them, to sell them, to carry them, to consume them, all those conducts are in most of the countries, in most of the districts, characterized as crime and have prison sentences associated with them. So let's place ourselves in Latin America. You know, especially in the Andean region of Latin America, many of the organic drugs are produced given to the altitude and the climate conditions in that area. Thousands of different routes take these substances to the main consumer centers in the north, in North America, one of them, but also in Europe. But with the time, we have developed growing consuming markets also in our countries. So Argentina and Brazil, for instance, are one of the countries where the cocaine consumption is augmenting in the last few years. So, given the nature of the laws, many of the people who with the time got involved in different stages of the producing or the transporting of these illicit substances have ended up in jail. In Latin America, we have very high rates of pretrial detention. So, and we have relatively slow judicial processes. Usually, the time a person would be waiting to be sentenced would be around 2, 3, 4 years, depending on the country and the situation. So this together has made up with a very complicated situation in prisons in terms of the increasing of numbers of people in there in relatively small amount of time. This is such a massive phenomenon that the global prison population has been affected. You see this more clearly again in Latin America, but it's a global trend. People charged with or convicted of offenses related to the provision of drugs represent a sizable proportion of the people in prison, both awaiting trial and serving sentences in many countries. And in Latin America, we can say that drug offenses convicts has virtually collapsed our penitentiary systems. Said the Colectivo de Estudios sobre Drogas y Derechos is probably one of the groups. There are mostly academics, but also academics who share some activist activity as well, have investigated this phenomenon of the impact on the prison population of all. They do comparative studies in different countries of Latin America, so those are some of the studies that address that. The drug control regime and the punitive responses to drugs have had serious impacts in the lives of women. Impacts that affect them, as Julia was saying at the beginning, in a particular way. And why is this? So why we can say that there are certain areas where the women are particularly affected. So one of them, for instance, if we take the area of cultivation, we take that many of the cultivations takes place in small-scale lands that are family-owned. Women have a role. They are especially related with the land and the taking care of the family. So many of the policies affecting the illicit cultivation will impact directly in this structural role that they would play there. And if we think, for instance, that some of those policies involved the fumigation of the entire area with glyphosate, that would affect the water, that would affect the food cultivations as well as the illicit ones, we can say that the impact on their families and the number of millions of people who have to fled or to escape those areas of cultivation because of systematic fumigation have been sustained and led by these women. Prison statistics show that a higher percentage of women than of men are in prison for drug offenses. This is a higher percentage. All the time, if we are talking about rough numbers, we will find much more men in prison for drug offenses and for general offenses in general. Around the world, let's say that more than 90%, more close to 95% of the prison population are men. And women in most of the country, they represent only a small population of the people who are in prison. But if we take drug offenses, the proportion of women that will be in prison for that offenses is much higher than men, and is fastly growing. What are the usual crimes that are women associated with drugs? So there is the cultivators, the micro-traffickers, who will be referring quite a bit today, and also known as couriers, and the home sellers in small scales. That is an activity where many women end up being involved, because it's an activity that can be carried out at home. It's compatible with the obligations of taking care of kids and elderly people in the family. But also consumers. We will find that around the world, and according to the estimation of Penal Reform International, out of all the people who are in prison for drug offenses, around 80% are there for crimes related with consumption. So over in there, we will find women consumers as well. Being women the fastest growing population in the world, we find in Latin America a particularly high level of increasement. And when I saying a particularly high level, I'm talking about big increasements that in some countries in the last 15 years goes up to 450%, like in Colombia, or we will find, for instance, the situation in Argentina in between 1989 and 2008, 271%. In Mexico, since 2007, 400% of increasement. In Brazil, the female population between 2005 and 2013 increased 290%. So we are talking about a level of increasement, and think about this from the point of view of the penitentiary system. None of our penitentiary system could manage this level of increasement. Think about the amount of prisons that the country has, and think that we are not talking about particularly wealthy countries. So how do you think that all these countries dealt with this increasement of level of people to sustain? In Argentina in 2005, for instance, there was a visit to the prisons in the north, that find that they were used containers as the ones you use for exports. And the containers were put in the patios of the prisons. And in there were 25 women in each of them, some of them with children. So there was an extremely chaotic way in the manner of the prison system managing these levels of increasement. So when we talk about this, we talk about big impacts in terms of conditions of detention. And we talk about this sometimes through the movies. We have these images of the prisons where you have all the people with the uniforms dressed the same and receiving their trays of food. So that is not the scene that you see in a Latin American prison. In a Latin American prison, people have to get their own clothing. They have to get many times their own food. The families had to carry them soap, shampoo, for women, the essential products. So it really puts the people inside the prison in a complicated positions in terms of accessing to food, for instance. That is why we see that in this kind of situations, usually inside the prison, you will see the levels of violence increasing a lot, because the conditions of detention are so much deteriorated because of the over-incarceration of people. If you see, there are a few countries like Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, and I think Peru. All of them have more than 60% of the women in prison they are for drug offenses. So we are talking about these drug laws that in the last 20 years have been the main driver of the increasement of these women in prison. And this has been neglected at the beginning, but slowly they later on recognized by some of the, for instance, UN mechanisms that deals with women's situations. So the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has 3 years ago produced a report on incarceration of women, and she was one of the first UN documents that officially identifies the anti-drug policies as the main drive for the increasement of incarceration of women. Yeah. What is more concerning is that these women do not really fit the stereotype of a high-level violent criminal. Although there are always exceptions, most of these women are first-time offenders, are condemned for low-level and non-violent drug offenses, as the one we described, small amount of selling at home, micro-trafficking, typically. They rarely pose a real threat to society, and the crimes that have committed are non-violent, and their incarceration contributes very little to the dismantling of illicit drug markets. So you will typically see in a prison hundreds of drug couriers, but it's very strange to find one that has been responsible for the cooptation of all these women, for the organization of these hundreds and hundreds of human couriers that are sent through their frontiers. So, and there has been a little of reaction from the part of the judicial institutions in our countries to identify the fact that even if they were detaining 10 women a day and all of them would be sent to prison with the same sentence immediately, in an automatic and bureaucratic way, there were a few investigations that aim to disarticulate these networks that works identifying situation of vulnerability in small communities and offering this job. So in the north of Argentina, for example, the deal would be to cross a frontier from Bolivia. Usually the payment would be around $300. That would be equivalent of a 6-month payment of a precarious job, whether it is in the side of Bolivia or in the north of Argentina. And in the story of most of the women involved in this job was something that had happened, like a death in the family, or they were selling food in the train station and the police shut down the stall, or the husband had left and there was something that precipitated a decision, try to cope up with a already difficult situation before, but that was aggravated by something. So many of these women are single mothers of several children. Some of them has also to care for elderly or disabled dependents in their family. Their incarceration can therefore have devastating impacts on their family, not only on them. Exacerbating the situation of poverty, abandonment, and marginalization of all the members of the family. Another thing that is very particular and repeated situation is that usually in none of our countries there is a formal mechanism that help the women in the moment of their detention to make decisions on their children. Usually it's quite informal the way that those decisions are taken. So some of the children end up being with a sister or with a brother-in-law or with a neighbor. Some of them will end up in institutions. Another thing to bear in mind on this that aggravates the situation of the women incarcerated for this kind of crime is that many of them, because of the nature of the crime, are detained in frontiers. Sometimes in the side of your own country, but sometimes on the other side. So when you are a foreigner, your network in the other countries will be always weaker. So you don't have family members to rely on. Nobody will bring you food or clothing to the prison. And also, with this regard of the managing of the children would aggravate the situation even further, because the consulates in these frontier areas are not very willing to deal with, first, inmates, and second, family affairs of the inmates. It's like the least of the concerns in this to this consulate personnel. So there are many women who do not even know what happened with some of the children, or with all of them, if they are with a neighbor, if they are with a family, or if they are in an institution. Very briefly, I will show you some of we collected many testimonies in different countries, and we found some typologies of repeated histories. Of course, each person is particular and have their own characteristics, but we wanted to reflect some of the stories. I will just go briefly over them, but you can go to the site and visit the description of these life stories that tells these pathways that we are talking about and that are so repeated in Latin America. This is another thing about the children in prison. They have to leave at some point. Only very small children are allowed to be with the mothers in the prison. So these children, after growing with the mothers and being with them the entire time, in the moment they turn 4 or 5, depending on the countries, they need to leave the institution. And also, these are the usual conditions of detentions that you will find. It's a small room where usually they would sleep together. Hopefully they have a TV so the kid can, watch some. And that is the way they live. There are not many facilities or special installation for children. So some of the stories, this is the Women Behind Bars is this series of photo essays that we collected in Colombia, in Costa Rica, in Argentina. We are producing one in Bolivia now. And Marie will tell you a little more about this project that we run with Colette and so many other colleagues and Corina in the region. This is just a part of the project that is communicating the stories of the women. So Angela is a Colombian woman. She was abused as a child by her mother and had her first child at the age of 14, had her second time at the age of 16, and her partner also committed acts of violence against her. She decided to introduce drugs in a prison facility. That is another very common way of the women to end up in prison, because instead of smuggling drugs through the frontiers, they will be hired to introduce drugs in prison facilities, for instance, for men. And she was caught in one of them, detected by dogs. And then this is another story that we have seen. They are not the more numerous, but it is certainly a very worrying population. There are women who are effectively coerced to do the trafficking, and they are co-opted by networks very similar and with modus operandi very similar to the networks who traffic people. So they would retain their passports, they would be locked up, their families would be threatened, and the thing that they have to do to be kind of released is to do this job. So this is a Venezuelan woman who was in this situation, and she was forced to smuggle drugs into Argentina and was caught in the frontier. Lydiate. She is from Costa Rica. She's one of the examples of this woman who sells drugs in the house as a way of, supporting their home and their children at the same time. She had 2 adult children that would participate with her, and they would caught with her and sent to prison as well. Sarah she's from Costa Rica, and she escaped from home at the age of 13, victim of sexual abuse by her uncle. She became a drug user, and she was a sex worker and was arrested for selling a small amount of crack to support her consumption. The association between different kinds of sexual or violence abuse to these women as when they were children, and the initiation in drug consumption at a very young age also is a pattern that is repeated and repeated. And that is why many times when we talk about drug treatments or harm reduction strategies for women, it's so important to include trauma attention in prison facilities and also outside the prisons, because many of the consumptions that started at a young age were associated with situations of abuse. And Joanna, she comes from a family involved in drug trade. Their parents would sell drugs at home since she was a child. She agreed when she was older to carry a bag to Europe, but instead of carrying a bag, she was forced to swallow 84 packets of cocaine that almost killed her. And she ended up going to prison in Venezuela for that crime. So these are some of the paths and the repeated situations that interviewing women in prison for drug offenses you would find at the different prisons. So when we talk about drug policy and drug policy problems, and this is the case many times here in Europe, we're thinking about consumers and we're thinking about harm reductions, etc. But from Latin America, the panorama goes deeper into other stages related with the drug markets. And we have not gone into much detail in all the dynamics that are around the cultivators, but those are rural areas with different kind of problems and many times abandoned by the state in terms of infrastructure. So all the drug policy reform that we are thinking and proposing, if we are thinking from a human rights perspective, should be thinking and should be attending all the related problems with these affected populations. I pass now to Marie, who will tell you a bit about what can be done about these problems.
My name is Marie Nugier, and I work for the International Drug Policy Consortium, which is a global network of NGOs that work on drug policy reform. So we don't really have a focus on gender or on women. We actually stumbled upon the issue of women when we started talking about repressive drug policies and their impact on the criminal justice system and on prison overcrowding. So we kind of came from the opposite way that Luciana came into the drug policy movement. So I think Luciana did a really good job at presenting the panorama in Latin America, the horrible impact that repressive drug policies and drug laws across Latin America can have on women, the fast increase in the female prison population, and that's pushed us to think about it and say, well, what can we do about it as activists, as advocates, as academics, and also as policymakers. And so we decided IDPC, Washington Office on Latin America, De Justicia, which is a Colombian organization, and the Inter-American Commission on Women of the Organization of American States, the CIM, to put together a working group of experts. So experts coming from the NGO field, from academia, from governments, and people focusing on issues related to drugs, but also to feminism, to women, to human rights, to criminal justice systems, to prisons. And so that's our working group, and it's been a fairly dynamic group, so some people came out of the group, some people came in. And the objective was to think through what we know about the issue and also to say, okay, what can we identify as new ways of thinking around drug policy? And how can we reduce the severe impact of our drug policies on women? So the objective, the critical objective, was to reduce the number of women in prison. And I think what Luciana has presented, what I'm going to present, and what Corina is certainly going to present is all around this key objective, is to reduce female incarceration. And this is through reforming harmful drug policies, but also thinking through any other areas of work that impact women. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but basically, poverty, marginalization, problems with gender inequality in a lot of countries in Latin America. The second objective was to show why this problem is important and needs to be urgently addressed. So, as Luciana said, women constitute a very small proportion of the prison population. So some policymakers told us when we started this project, why should we care? Women are 6% of our prison population. Why should we even start talking about it? And actually, we do need to start talking about it when we see that this small segment of the prison population is fast increasing, and it's a global trend. So Latin America is the most dramatic one, but when you look at Southeast Asia, when you look at Central Asia, you have the similar trend. So we do need to question why this is happening. And when you look at women incarcerated, there's a very, very clear link between incarceration and harmful drug laws. Another objective of ours was to break the myths around women incarcerated for drug offenses, and that's one of the reasons why we put together that photo project that Luciana presented, was to break the myths, to say that's the women's that we are incarcerating, that's the women's on which the resources that we have available for drug law enforcement are focusing on. So instead of focusing on murderers, rapers, criminals, we actually focus on vulnerable people who really should not be in the prison in the first place. And finally, and something that has been a significant challenge for us, and I think it continues to be, and we keep having this recurring conversation, is how can we bring the voice of affected women to the table? How can we make sure that they have space to talk to their governments about how the national policies affect them, and how can they support activists and governments in identifying better ways to address their issues that they're facing. So to do that, the working group came together regularly and we put together a guide, so a regional guide for policy reform. So the guide was developed over probably a year, and it was launched in February 2016 under the auspices of the Organization of American States. And it was quite exciting actually, because we launched the guide and then the OAS came to see us and they were like, how come our logo is not on the guide? So we were like, okay, we'll put it in. So that was great because it really enabled us to get much more credibility and to make sure that we could start discussing the guide in many instances at the OAS, but also at the United Nations level and in a lot of countries in the region. So the objective of this guide, and I encourage you to have a look, I only have one copy here unfortunately, but it's online, so I encourage you to have a look. The objective is to provide concrete recommendations on alternative policy options. So it focuses on 7 thematic issues, and I won't be able to go in detail, but I just wanted to mention them. So one of them is around more inclusive drug policies, so trying to remove the extreme marginalization that current drug policies are causing to women. Another one is drug policy reform, so going from decriminalization to proportionality of sentencing. Another one is critical alternatives to incarceration. One section focusing on cultivation. As Luciana said, we know very little about women and in cultivation areas in Latin America, so it's one of the issues that we need to strengthen, but we still have a few key guidelines on how to address the issue. Social inclusion, one section on pregnant women and children, because that was a recurring issue among the women that we interviewed. And data collection. So one of the issues that we saw is that there's very little data on the women, who they are, where they come from, what's their background, what are they incarcerated for, and did they or did they not benefit from the current alternatives that already exist. Yeah? So the recommendations, I will really go very quickly, but basically need for more data on the scale, but also the impact of incarceration on women. The need to decriminalize drug use and possession of small amounts of drugs. The need to ensure proportionality of sentencing, and this includes first a reduction in penalties, but also the consideration of mitigating circumstances. So, for example, what we've seen in a lot of countries is that some women will transport a whole range of drugs, like a big amount of drugs. But when you look at the role that they play in the drug trade, it's a minimal role. They're very, low in the drug trafficking chain. So they shouldn't be given sentences that are higher than rape or murder. And that's what's happening currently in Latin America. Promoting alternatives to incarceration is also a key recommendation. So what's important now to figure out is what kind of alternatives we want to focus on. And obviously the need to ensure that prison is only used as a last resort. And finally, I think these two kind of come together. So focusing on the underlying causes of involvement in the drugs trade. So why do these women even engage in the drugs trade? And a lot of times, as Luciana said, many of them just want some financial gain to get ends meet. Yeah. And finally, focusing on policies supporting women post-incarceration. So prison is harmful and it's in the long term. So women, when they come out of prison, they have a criminal record, they can't find a job. What can they do? Well, they go back to the drugs trade. That's the only possibility. Yeah. So that's something that really needs to be addressed. So to accompany the guide and to make sure that we had some concrete examples to show policymakers, we actually put together a series of publications that we call Exploring Innovative Approaches. And the objective of that is to take the guidance from the recommendations that we have in there that are very technical and say, well, this is what's happening in practice in countries from all over the world. So we're looking at Uruguay, Costa Rica, Argentina, Portugal, so a whole bunch of different contexts, and try to see what's the evidence of effectiveness of certain policies compared to what has been done in very repressive contexts. And how can we apply this to women? Because some of the policies are really good, but they don't necessarily have a gender focus. Or some policies are focusing on gender, but are not necessarily focused on drugs. So, it's kind of a balance to try and figure out what kind of policies could be helpful for us to promote to policymakers to change what's going on right now in the region. So I also encourage you to have a look at those. They're quite short, like 2-3 pages per brief, so it's quite easy to navigate them. Another thing that we've done then, based on the regional guide and on these innovative approaches, was to use that to open space for the debate in national context. So people from the working group traveled to Costa Rica, Colombia, Uruguay, Argentina, Mexico, and we organized what we call seminars or informal dialogues, where we brought people from the working group. So depending on the context, we promoted the inclusion of people from academia or people from NGOs or public defenders, depending on what worked best in terms of interlocutor, in terms of messenger for each of the contexts. For example, in the Dominican Republic last year, we organized a meeting with public defenders from all over the country to open the debate on the issue of women incarcerated for drug offenses. And we had, within our working group, we have 2 fantastic public defenders, one from Costa Rica and one from Ecuador. And so they started talking, and it was amazing because they literally just spoke the same language. And they were just exchanging and trying to see how the experiences of Costa Rica and Ecuador fit with the one in the Dominican Republic, and how this exchange of experience could help bring the debate to the table. And finally, something that we really tried to do at national level was to ensure the participation of affected women in the debate. And that's incredibly difficult because in a lot of contexts, women do not want to engage. They've just come out of prison. They want to put that experience behind them. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to reminisce. In other contexts, it's very, very difficult to bring a woman from one country to another because of their criminal record, because they've never traveled outside of their country. They don't have a passport. They need a visa, which might be denied. So all of these considerations that mean that it's very difficult for them to get to the table. However, we have managed to do this in a few places. So in Costa Rica, for example, we first launched these guides, and for the very first time, we started interviewing some women, and we interviewed 2 women who had just come out of prison as a result of a reform in Costa Rica that enabled them to come out earlier than their sentence. And so one of these women was incredibly powerful, and we were organizing a seminar the next day to present the guide, and we asked her to come and to present her story, and it was the first time that a formerly incarcerated woman for a drug offense was having this dialogue with our government. And she was just incredibly powerful, Priscilla, and we tried to bring her to a few other forums later on so that she could talk about her story. In Colombia, so our Colombian colleagues de Justicia, they also released a guide, and for the release of the guide that was hosted with the Ministry of Justice, they managed to pull out a woman from prison so that she could also tell her story. So whenever possible we do that, but that's a massive challenge for us to continue doing this kind of stuff. Up here, this is a meeting that we had in Mexico in June, and we brought a woman, a formerly incarcerated woman from the US, Andrea James, who's an incredibly powerful advocate. And she's now here with 3 women from Mexico who were formerly incarcerated, and Corinna can probably talk a bit more about this afterwards. So they started also an exchange on their experiences across continents. In terms of international advocacy, something that we've been trying to do as well is to reach out to the UN and make sure that the issue of women and drugs made it to the debate. And that's incredibly difficult because the UN drug control agencies do not want to talk about women. And then the human rights and gender UN organizations do not want to touch on drugs issues. So our role as the working group has been to try and cross-link these issues together in Vienna, in New York, and in Geneva. And highlight the links between, women, exploitation, violence, criminal justice systems, and incarceration. And so one final thing that I wanted to show is the human face. So Luciana has already presented this. So this is one of the key aspects of our project, and we're continuing to build on the profiles, like the photo project, the photos that we already have. So you can, if you go on the website of the project, you can read through the whole story of these women, so how they engaged, why, and what has been the consequence on their lives. And these are incredibly powerful stories, and when we are not able to bring women to the table, then for us it's a way to make sure that they are there, at least in spirit, and that we can show what they have been going through and what the impact of horrible drug policies can have on these women. And so here, because Luciana has been presenting a few profiles already, I just wanted to show that one because so this is Joanna, and she's one of the 2 women that we had interviewed in Costa Rica. And this shows the long-term impact of these repressive drug policies, and that's why I wanted to show that one in particular. So Joanna was sentenced for 5 years, 4 months for attempting to bring drugs into a prison, a male prison. And she was only released after 4 months because of a policy reform in Costa Rica. So Joanna is 28, and you can see that you don't see her face. She refused to show her face because there's so much stigma associated with her story. So she preferred that we don't show her. So she's 28, and she's a single mother of 6 children of different fathers. And to feed her children, she agreed to bring drugs into a prison. It seemed like easy money, but she says that at the last minute she gave the drugs to the guards in an attempt to come clean. She just got really scared and she said, okay, I'm just giving the drugs and then I'll be safe. But it was too late and she was arrested and charged. If I didn't provide for my children, they would have died of hunger. It's the easy money that always conquers you because you never think about the consequences in the moment. You only think of what you're going to bring home and give to them. She waited a long time, 2 years, for her trial. When it finally happened, she was only given 1 day's notice before she had to appear in court. After her conviction, Joanna couldn't bear to tell her children that she was sent to prison. When she called home, they asked where she'd gone, and she told them that she was working. I cried for a month, day and night, for my children. I was going to give up because I couldn't bear to hear them on the phone crying and saying, "Mama, when do you get off work?" And to have to swallow my tears and say, "I have a lot of work, my love, soon." She benefited from Costa Rica's sentencing reform and was released after 4 months in prison. When she was reunited with her family, her youngest child didn't recognize her. When I got off the bus, it was hard to see their little eyes full of tears. My daughter, who's now 3, said to me, "That's not Mama, that's not Mama." Because she had gone 4 months without seeing me, she just kept looking at me and I said to her, "Yeah, it's me, it's me." Now Joanna is in a dire situation, without family support, a home or a job. She was recently kicked out of her house. Her criminal record makes getting a job nearly impossible. For now, she relies on child support from the father of one of her sons to support her 6 children. What I have on hand is $75 for my son's child support. And with that, I'm trying to find a place to stay, to at least be able to give that and later pay the rest. But so far, it has not been possible. Her offense will continue to stay in her record for the next 10 years. So the silver lining of this specific story is that Costa Rica has just reviewed that criminal record policy and, sorry, just wanted to acknowledge while I'm here. So Costa Rica has just reviewed their policy and they have now done a whole bunch of different reforms in terms of gender and the fact that they recognize the marginalization and vulnerability of these women. But what they've done is that they've decided in January this year to remove criminal records or to reduce the length of the criminal record for vulnerable people who are involved in the drugs trade. So I just wanted to say that, and hopefully stories like Joanna will be a little bit easier to swallow because the criminal record will be reduced, so their possibility of reintegrating into society will be made a little bit easier. But I think Costa Rica is an exception in the world, and in most of Latin America, the criminal record is a massive barrier to people starting their lives after incarceration. So thank you so much, and I encourage you to have a look at the project, at the photo projects in particular, and the policy guides. Thank you.
My name is Corina. I'm going to talk about Mexico. I'll try to be quick so we can have time for questions. Not quick, specific. We are going to look into context, women in prison for drug offenses, and what we are doing in terms of advocacy. So let's start. As you surely well know, Mexico is immersed in a context of war on drugs, very heavy one. It's a producing, a trafficking, and a consumer country. Most countries are. The difference between these categories obviously are blurring, but some countries have more tendencies towards one of these activities than others. So Mexico is mainly a producing and trafficking countries. In recent years, we have witnessed a proliferation of drug cartels, mainly due to separation of some groups and fragmentation of others, which has led to an increase in violence among groups, but also to a very repressive, violent response from the government, which has increased the use of the military and the navy in policing activities, the increase in human rights violation and homicide rates, with high levels of impunity, especially when it comes to state violence. So torture has been defined as a systemic, and sexual torture has also been noticed. It's against men, but also against men, but especially, of course, against women. So we have recommendations from human rights commissions showing how when someone is detained, usually there is psychological and physical violence against the person, threats against their family, the threat of never seeing their children again, and sometimes the sexual violence against women, sexual torture, increases when the woman declares to be pregnant. So the police start to get more violent, even to the point of causing miscarriages. There are cases like that. So we have an increase in violence in all senses. In legal terms, when it comes to drug policy, what do we have? Pretty much what's being already told. We have a mandatory minimum sentences. We have mandatory use of a pretrial detention for most drug offenses. We have some other nice stuff like disproportionate sentences. We have an imperfect system of depenalization of possession. So Mexican authorities will tell you, well, possession for consumption is not criminalized in Mexico. Maybe it's not, but it's so badly decriminalized that it ends up increasing the number of people who could possibly be accused of retail trade. So we also have an expansion of drug courts. Now, in 2016, at the General Assembly special session on drugs, on gas, Peña Nieto gave a great discourse which ended saying how we had to go from a prohibition system to an effective regulation system. That has yet to be seen. So there's not been major changes in drug laws, and there's a lot of work to be done. Now, this happens in a context of economic and social inequality, very profound, one of the most unequal countries, one of the most unequal regions in the world, which is Latin America. High levels of violence against women and almost absolute indifference and impunity of violence against women and girls. Racism. The permanence of asymmetrical gender relationships and corruption. So given this inspiring panorama, what's going to be the situation of women for drug offenses, in prison for drug offenses? Very similar to what my colleagues and friends and wonderful ladies have already said. We have an increase, a very striking increase in the number of women in prison for general and mainly for drug offenses. In Mexico, there are about 13,000 women in prison, representing one of the highest female prison population in the world, but still they represent 5% of the general prison population in the country. Drug offenses represented the second cause for incarceration at the local level, local crimes, and the first cause for incarceration at the federal level. Now, I forgot to say that this data happen in a context of big impunity. So in Mexico, we have 93.7% of unreported crimes. I'm not sure what's the word in English. In Spanish, we say la cifra negra de los delitos. The
crime statistic. The dark figure.
Dark figure. So really, we don't know who commits crimes. We don't even know what crimes are committed, because then of these small, less than 6% of crimes that are reported, only about 2% end up in prison. So when we cross the door of a prison, all what we know is against whom this big, expensive, violent machinery of the state acts against. Bit of a grammar mess there, but I hope I got it. So that's what we know. And when it comes to women, we see exactly what Luciana and Marie told us. Mainly uneducated women coming from high levels of social exclusion and poverty, with a history of victimization, of physical, psychological violence, and also sexual one. And it's incredible how that doesn't change generation after generation. We can see women in prison who are 20, 25, 26, or women who are 70, 75, 80. And they have very similar stories of gender-based violence, including rape or attempted rape. So that doesn't seem to be changing. And most of them are induced to committing the offense or getting involved in trafficking through their male partners, which reflects in a way which mirrors the persistence of these asymmetrical gender relationships in the region and in Mexico. And what activities do they commit? Well, what activities are they incarcerated for? Because, I repeat, we don't really know what crimes are committed and by whom. We only know who we incarcerate. Retail sale, of course, is one of the main activities, and on all the different settings that Luciana described. Actually, both at the federal and local level, the offense of possession, simple possession or possession with the purpose of selling, trading, trafficking, and so on, is the main cause of incarceration. And a very female activity is the introduction of drugs into prison centers, because we have a vagina where things can be hidden, and we are willing to use it if our boyfriends or husbands or whoever asks us to, or if our children need to eat something more than tap water. So that's a very female activity, to hide drugs in the vagina and take it into prisons. And national trafficking and international trafficking. Also, others get involved through consumption. They are arrested for simple possession. Usually they're given an alternative sanction, but then when the second detention happens, because of the criminal records, they will be put to prison, and that happens over and over. So we have consumers who really do not get access to any treatment in case they wanted one, but can have several tickets to prison. And what we also see is that there's very little police investigation. So this is why we always find this population in prison, because these are the people who are very easily captured by the by the criminal justice system. So there's a very special condition in terms of prison conditions for women accused of drug offenses in Mexico. Now, the country has a bit more than 300 prisons, of which about 15 are female only, and that still does not guarantee proper women-centered conditions. Actually, it can make the distance to their family even bigger if they're sent to this very little female prisons for women. But that gets worse at the federal level. Since December 2004, there's only one federal female prison in Mexico. And basically most of the women who are sent there are accused of organized crime with processes that can last up to 8 or 9 years, 9 years of a pretrial detention, and or for federal drug offenses. I go as a visitor to this prison, and each time I go, which is once a month at the most, I spend about $40 altogether. Now, for me, it's doable. I'm one person and I live quite close to the prison. It only takes me 3 hours to get there, which is nothing in a country like Mexico. So it's fine, I can do that. But let's imagine the families of these women who also are taking care of their children, and plus the federal system is very perverted. The visiting day rotates every week. There's no fixed visiting day. So who does have a job that allows him or her to every week take a different day off? I do as a researcher and as a consultant, but not many people have that privilege. And the people inside the federal system do not have free access to telephones. Telephones are something fundamental to all people in prison, of course, as much as visits, but even more so to women, especially when they're single mothers, and that's the only way of exercising some form of motherhood. So it's a very strict prison conditions, and it's falling basically on these secondary subjects of international drug trafficking, these women, who some of them can get to some levels of leadership, especially in organized crime organizations, but not so much the ones who are caught for federal drug offenses. So, what are we doing in terms of advocacy? And when I say we, I refer to the organization I work with, EKIS Justice for Women, a feminist organization that works on access to justice for women and has a component on women in prison for drug offenses, and also as part of the working group and the work we're doing with WOLA and so on. So in 2016, we published a policy brief, which went quite well, and with recommendations to different audiences. One of them was the legislative power, and from that, we managed to start working on a law initiative with the 2 federal deputies that has many components. One of them, inspired by the Costa Rica experience, is to reduce prison sentences for some specific drug offenses for some specific categories of women, reproducing the paradigm of vulnerability, motherhood, all these things that sometimes feminists do not quite agree with. But if that can help women spend less time in prison, and if it can work as a bridge to move these drug laws that haven't been moved for years, we think it's a good idea to move forward with this initiative, and we're going to start moving it in this period, basically. Then we're going to publish soon a guide, very well based on the model of the guide we worked together with WOLA and ADPC and so on, with an intersectional approach to women. So we're looking at quantitative and qualitative data that do not only take gender into account, but also if they're indigenous, if they have some form of disability, what other factors interrelate with gender in shaping the female prison population and their experience of incarceration. And also, of course, with recommendations to different audiences. Then we are organizing meetings with the Foreign Ministry and with the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the National Institute of Women, basically trying to put together around the table different federal institutions and try to get to concrete changes. Not going so well, but we're still gonna try to move things. Then we're doing a research on drug courts with a gender perspective, trying to look at how the expansion of drug courts, if drug courts, the way that they're functioning in Mexico, have or do not have a gender perspective in terms of the drug users, but also of the families of the men who get captured by these programs. And also we are working with WOLA, a project coordinated and led by WOLA, doing some videos with women in a state prison, in a female prison in Oaxaca. Then they will be out in a few months, a very potent tool. And what the difficulties, first of all, is to get people together, like the institutions at first are very enthusiastic, but then since it's a matter of women, they send people who look at gender issues. And very often, they send people that have no power of expressing opinions. They just go to take notes at the meetings and have a very little knowledge of the topic we're talking about. So it's very difficult to get institutions involved and to keep a high level of these meetings and to get concrete changes. So, and then, well, there are some other problems, but I really want to try to stop now. What are the next steps that we're going to take? Of course, to continue to monitor and talk to women, always with a feminist conviction that our work has to improve women's lives, and also as an academic with a conviction that research has to have public policy endings, especially in a continent like Latin America, in a region like Latin America. We cannot just do bureau academia, we have to be engaged in changing things. I think there's a need to widen the agenda. We need to look more at drug users. It's something that's not very looked into in our work. Also widen the gender agenda, perhaps go beyond women, and focusing on the impact of drug policy on their children. That's another issue that's very important to touch. And always working on two parallel levels. On the one hand, try to push for these reforms that are much needed, but that also can remain only at the superficial level. But at the same time, together with this immediate action, take a more profound and deep analysis of structural conditions. Always stressing the relationship. When we look at drug policy and women, I think we always have to stress the relationship of violence against women, racism, and classism. We cannot detach gender and drugs from this, because drugs are only the top of the iceberg of structural, institutional violence, corruption, and the persistence of patriarchy in society. Thank you.
Completely uncontroversial conclusion there, but for any of you who might be a little bamboozled as to what you've just heard and think that you've come to see you to be defending drug trafficking and what kind of moral establishment are we, I just think it's important that we maybe just give you a little bit of context here, if you're not familiar, which is that we have been trying to prevent people from consuming intoxicating substances for over 100 years. The first international meeting on trying to control the flow of opium was in 1908. So this is a very long-running effort to control certain substances, not alcohol, you'll notice, and not tobacco, also you'll notice, where we have regulatory systems. And for those of you, again, who aren't familiar with this area, the key aspect here is there is an international convention. There's a series of international conventions through which all countries, no matter where you're from, you are mandated to operate within this system. And the key convention here is the 1961 Single Convention. And of particular importance, the 61 Single Convention seeks to eliminate, completely eradicate from the surface of the earth all coca, opium and cannabis production. And initially, the period set out for this, so opium production, opium cultivation, was to be eradicated, this was from 1961, within a 15-year time frame. Now, it's not done very well. But the key thing here, obviously, is that the United Nations and the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which administers and oversees the conventions and ensures compliance, has continued to reiterate this emphasis on achieving essentially a world free of drugs. And the most recent statement on achieving a drug-free world, as it was called, was in 1998. So the key thing here is it's not been very successful, and when you work in policy and you look at a policy process which has been so profoundly wrong and flawed and failed and goes against every aspect of evidence, and yet this is still continuing today. And we really saw, and the kind of broader context for this discussion here is that in the 1980s, when the international community, in particular led by the United States of America at this point in time, became frustrated at the lack of traction and progress in reducing international drug cultivation and production, they stepped up efforts to achieve this kind of drug-free world, and it became a war on drugs in the 1980s. You can't really have a war on drugs, just like you can't have a war on chairs or a war on air. You can't have a war on an inanimate object. But the key thing is that drug wars can never be won. And the reason why the drug wars can never be won is multiple and very simple. Because as long as there is demand, there will be supply. And every time you have a successful interdiction, okay, if we have, as we always see in our domestic newspapers, we'll have a big police raid and they will seize a larger quantity of drugs. Well, if you're a drug dealer, that's fantastic. Because what that's going to do, it's going to take out your competitor in the market and it's going to drive up the cost of the drugs because shortage increased prices. So this war on drugs is just going round and round and round, and with the harsher enforcement, we're seeing higher levels of violence. So we don't see it really as being a war on drugs. We see this as a war on people, and we see this in particular as a war on the poorest people. And we, these discussions we have around women, we also have similar discussions in terms of race. But in particular, and the last point I want to make before we go over to questions, is about the distinction between the global north and the global south. Now, what's interesting about our discussions about cocaine is that cocaine is actually one of the least consumed drugs in the world. The most consumed drugs in the world, we don't really know how many drugs are consumed in the world, okay, because the criminalisation of drugs, if you're living in a country where they have the death sentence for drug use or very harsh prison sentences, and you ask people, when did you last use cocaine, they tend not to be that open about the answers they're going to give you. So we don't really have very good statistics about drug use. But what we do know from the rough estimates is cocaine is one of the least globally consumed drugs. The most widely globally consumed drugs are synthetic drugs. And these are drugs such as MDMA ecstasy, methamphetamine, amphetamine. So these are synthetic chemical drugs. But the whole focus of the international system, for some reason which I'm sure you can maybe get to yourselves, is that it's been constantly a focus on eradication of these cash crops, these commodities, which are cultivated in the global south. So we have this real disparity in the way that the war on drugs is executed, and a particularly onerous burden is borne by those countries in Latin America and in Southwest Asia and Southeast Asia, which are these kind of centres of drug crop cultivation. Leading centres of synthetic drug production, may surprise you, a lot of these are in terrible narco states such as the Netherlands, Poland, America, okay? But just think about how this war on drugs is executed, and then hopefully that will enable you to understand why we believe that this issue around the incarceration of women and the way women are impacted by this is really one of the gravest aspects of the way that the drug war is executed.